Welcome back to another podcast episode. Time for a quick roundup of the latest headlines making news. Trump is at it again, playing the hokey pokey with global trade. Put the tariffs in, pull the tariffs out, and you shake them all about. You get the idea. For now, tariffs on Canadian goods are on hold until April 2nd. But Prime Minister Carney is facing criticism for backtracking on his campaign promise of dollar-for-dollar counter tariffs. At a recent press conference, he acknowledged that while the approach has its limits, Canada has already placed $150 billion in counter tariffs on the table. Now it's just a waiting game until April 2nd to see what happens next. If Trump moves forward with a 25% across-the-board tariff, the OECD predicts Canada's economy will slow to just 0.7% growth over the next year, way down from the previous 2% projection. But let's shift gears to today's episode. This is part 2 of our 3-part series on Let's Talk Economics, and I'm joined by the brilliant Canadian economist Don Drummond. Today, we're tackling Canada's productivity problem and dive into why our small businesses struggle to scale, how government policy can help them grow into industry leaders, and why we need to reduce our dependence on American imports. We also break down the entrepreneurial and cultural differences between the US and Canada, and what it will take to make Canada a top destination for business investment. And, as a bonus, Don shares some fascinating tidbits from his time in the Department of Finance, working with former Prime Ministers Jean Chrétien and Brian Mulroney. So, let's talk economics with Don Drummond. So we know a strong economy needs strong productivity. It drives growth, creates jobs, and boosts wages. But we also know Canada's productivity has stalled dramatically over the years and fallen further and further behind the US. But with these global trade tensions, shifting demographics, and climate change threatening to push inflation even higher, improving productivity is more important than ever. What can the government do to increase that productivity? This has obviously been a concern that the governor of Bank of Canada has also raised, and why we haven't seen rates drop maybe nearly as fast, because it comes down to that productivity piece. Also, shelter costs are a huge burden for Canadians, and we're seeing more Canadians take on more debt. But yeah, just going back to it, how can we improve productivity in Canada?
Well, you've opened the door in a room where I'll stay for the rest of this time period, but that's on you. You opened it, because this is my thing. I have spent much of my working time as an economist trying to understand why the productivity in Canada is so weak. And I thought I had it figured out. And I wrote all kinds of articles. It was all on the doorstep of governments. We had high and volatile inflation. Hence we had higher interest rates in Canada. We had high corporate and personal income tax rates. We had high debt burdens, which made it very difficult to borrow. We had tight regulation. We had high state ownership. Remember, it wasn't that long ago we even owned an oil company. We owned the transportation companies. And the list went on. There was all kinds of bad examples of public policy. But guess what? Lo and behold, one by one, government started to improve them. They didn't fix them all by means, but virtually everything on that list of bad policy did get better after about the mid-1990s, and yet the productivity didn't go up. And so I started thinking by around 2010, maybe this isn't all on the doorstep. Maybe there's something in the private sector. And then I ran into a quintessential Canadian problem. If you want to do research on business sector data, you can't access it. At that time, in 2010, when I wanted to open up this branch of research, the only people who could access the business data files of Statistics Canada were in one particular group of Statistics Canada. It wasn't even all the employees of Statistics Canada. It was one group. It was a former professor from Queens that ended it. Thank goodness, because he did a lot of research, but none of the rest of us could do that. In fact, none of the rest of us could even check the research of that group because we didn't have access to the data. I spent 3 years on a project called Free the Data, and it started off with making a pitch to shirk the granting council to give some money to access it. And so we actually do have access to the business data now. It took a long time. There's a network of researchers, but it's not free. If you want to do a project with it, it typically costs you about $10,000. It's the ultimate irony. Where do you get the $10,000? Well, typically from Shirt. So one arm of the government has to raise the money to pay another argument. The data are undocumented for the most part. There's gaps in it. So my thought was, why are Canadian companies not more ambitious? If I were to put up a chart of the distribution of the size of Canadian businesses, you will see wherever the small business deduction level is, you will see a mass of companies just below that. And that's partly psychological. We had this mantra, the small businesses, we just love them to death. We give them virtually zero tax burden. We give them a research and development tax credit that's over double for large corporations. We give them a lighter regulatory burden. And we say that they create all the jobs, and that may be true on the growth side, but they destroy most of the jobs as well. Large corporations have more stable employment. They pay better. They're more likely to have benefits. They're more likely to do research. They're more likely to export. I have nothing against small businesses. By definition, businesses need to start small, but why don't we have them continue to grow? And this is a big difference between Canada and the United States. We create businesses at a more rapid clip than the United States, but we tend to stall out or they sell when they get to about $500,000 of revenue. In the United States, they continue to grow. There is, to a degree, a policy element. We shouldn't have a split corporate tax regime. We shouldn't have a higher marginal tax rate when we become large. We are more risk averse, and that's a cultural thing. It's well known in the United States. You can go broke, as did their president a number of times, and come back. You can declare personal bankruptcies, and you're going to get 8 credit cards in the mail the next day, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So there are some cultural aspects, but that's a very long way of saying, in part, it's on the doorsteps of governments. Even today, there's things that they can do. We did create a corporate tax advantage beginning in 2000. That has now disappeared with operations of others. We have our tax system skewed far too heavily in favor of small companies and large corporations, but we don't have a business sector that's sufficiently entrepreneurial. I was shocked in the mid-2000s that we weren't seeing an increase in business investment, because most of the business investment is imported, and the Canadian dollar was strong and it was appreciating, so business investment was cheap. Retained earnings, the corporate sector were very strong, so they had the wherewithal to invest more, but they weren't. And I posed that question to John Manley when he was the head of the Business Council of Canada, and he said, well, I'll do better than that. Come to the annual general meeting of the Business Council of Canada and ask all the members. So they're in front of me, the 150 CEOs of the biggest companies in Canada, and I asked them. And their answer was basically what economists have rudely called the lazy manufacturer's hypothesis. They said for many years they thought the appreciation of the Canadian dollar was temporary. The Canadian dollar would depreciate. That would make them competitive, and they wouldn't really need to get out of bed. They didn't say that, but that was sort of what they were saying. And they said by around 2007, we thought, well, maybe the Canadian dollar is not going to depreciate, and they did start to invest, but then they got clobbered by the financial crises. So, the lazy manufacturer's hypothesis is you take a low value of the Canadian dollar and you don't have to be very productive. But how's that working out for us? We do have the low value of the Canadian dollar, and we're not doing very well in the manufacturing space, but because we've frittered it away through the weakness of productivity. So that hasn't worked. So the short answer is there's a lot of things that need to be done. And in my mind, they're not all that. That led to me I wrote an article in 2011 called The Confessions of a Serial Productivity Researcher. And that was me basically saying that all those articles I'd written previously blaming it all on governments maybe weren't right. And maybe we should start looking at the private sector and why they weren't more ambitious. So again, we're not really that entrepreneurial, not as sufficiently entrepreneurial as we should be.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I came from a family of entrepreneurs and seen the sacrifices. One day you could be thriving, the next day you're claiming bankruptcy and have to build up from there. A few points I want to pick out from there is, I don't know if you've been hearing this the same. I just know for my generation, we're hearing a lot more people talk about class these days, especially as we're in an affordability crisis. We're in a housing crisis in Canada. Millennials and Gen Zs and Alpha are really struggling. They're working hard, but not moving forward as we've seen our past generations do. And one thing that I feel like we keep hearing is tax the rich, tax the rich. You mentioned that a lot of Canadian policies or tax policies have favored smaller businesses. Do you think if we're looming with a new government, hopefully by the spring, do you think policies that incentivize corporations and help out bigger corporations, like lowering those tax rates, which is what we've seen Trump kind of toot about, does that actually benefit society, or is this a bit of an illusion to it?
Oh, absolutely. I'll go back into my history again. In the late 1990s, when I was responsible for fiscal and tax policy through Finance Canada, I wanted to have the corporate tax rate lowered. And I had to be very mindful. My masters were a Liberal government. And you think on the surface, that's not something they're going to be all that keen about. I, yet again, learned a lesson about John Chrétien. I had this timid plan to begin very minor corporate income tax reductions that we're going to narrow our disadvantage with other countries, not even open an advantage, just narrow the disadvantage. It was a defensive maneuver. I convinced Paul Martin to support it, but he said I needed to convince John Chrétien. So I went over to the Langevin block where the Privy Council office is, and I was in a boardroom with the two principal advisors, Eddie Goldenberg and Aviva Hozek, to John Chrétien. And I had sent over my proposal in advance, and the meeting opened with Eddie Goldenberg saying, the boss doesn't like your plan. He always referred to Chrétien as the boss. And I thought to myself, oh, here we go. I knew that was going to happen. And he says, the boss thinks the plan is too timid. He wants to cut the corporate tax more. And I got up and I walked out of the room. And I went into the hallway and I looked at the nameplate on the door. And Eddie and Aviva came running after her and said, what are you doing? Why did you run out of the room? And I said, I thought I was in the wrong place. I thought I mistakenly walked into the office of the leader of the opposition. And they said, quit fooling around and get back in there. And I eventually then did speak to Chrétien, and Chrétien said, yeah, you probably don't think this is on the top of my list, but you know what? If we want to have jobs, we need to have corporations, and if we want to have corporations, they have to be competitive. And again, not for the first time, I thought, that guy, it's not from the textbooks and all that stuff. It's common sense stuff, but he knew it, and that began the beginning of the corporate tax reductions. And now other countries have leapfrogged over us, and unfortunately, we need to do that again. Particularly with the so-called reforms that Trump did, and I say the so-called because he didn't do a reform. The U.S. has a terrible tax system. It's just riddled with loopholes and exemptions. It's very inefficient. All he did is cut the rate for corporations. He didn't fix up the tax structure, but it did destroy the advantage that we had at one point. So you have to give them a competitive playing field, but they've got to do something with it too. We've learned a lesson that is a necessary, but it's not necessarily a sufficient condition for the Canadian corporate sector to thrive. And of course, they need highly talented people. You're not going to get highly talented people when you have marginal tax rates of over 50%, which Canada has. And this is a lesson, one of the benefits of being that quintessential small open country is we can look at examples around the world. And Sweden started an experiment where they went to a competitive corporate tax rate and didn't get the results that they wanted. And they figured out the reason they're not getting in the results is because they have super high personal income tax rates and their corporations are not able to draw the talented people from around the world. So that, being somewhat of a left-leaning country, wasn't in their grab bag of instincts to lower their personal tax rates, but they ended up doing that. We've shown quantitatively the latest surtax on high-income individuals in Canada actually lowered revenues. When you're facing a marginal tax rate of over 50%, your first thought when you're faced with the prospect of earning more money, are you going to take a promotion? Are you going to do overtime? Or are you going to do that? Is I'm going to get to keep less than half of it. It doubles your incentives to work, save, and invest. And if you look at it from an investor's perspective, if you're not in a tax-protected savings vehicle, right off the bat, you've lost over half of those savings. And then you start to wonder, is it worthwhile to save? So we already push harder than we can. That doesn't mean you can't raise taxes. We have the allegedly unpopular GST, which is a much lower economic cost. And that's an interesting lesson as well, because going back when we put the GST into place, of course, it became folklore how much everybody hates it. And we were inundated with surveys and focus groups saying that. But I asked the people doing those focus groups and polls, okay, now be more sophisticated. Ask a paired question. Would you rather pay the personal income tax or the GST? And the answer came back overwhelmingly, they would rather pay the GST because they're smart. they realize you can't avoid the personal income tax. Not only do you have to pay the personal income tax if you're earning income, but you'll end up paying it 2 or 3 times, because if you do manage to have any savings, you'll pay the tax again on the savings. You don't have to pay the GST. You simply don't need to consume. If you save the money, you don't pay the GST. So we should be altering our tax system to put much heavier reliance on the consumption taxes and much less reliance on the income taxes. But that is always perceived to be unpopular, although Quebec has done it in the past. They've done it twice, and the governments did get reelected.
Interesting. A lot of different angles there. And I was not in that story about Jean Chrétien. So that is a wild, wild piece of history that happened. I want to talk about that tax piece there. So Harper obviously brought in the HST, where he combined PST and GST on goods and services. Was that beneficial? Like, do you think that it's still relevant? At the time when it came in, we were a little bit in a shaky financial crisis. Now that we're, again, struggling with this affordability crisis, do you think we would see at any point maybe splitting that up again, or doing something similar to your point about putting that more on the consumer or non-personal income taxes, but more on different goods, something similar to how Europe has their tax system with the VAT, where it's just embedded in? I know it's a bit two different angles on that question, but I'm just curious about your perspective around that.
Well, I'll deal with the price embedded, because that's really quite simple. The economics of that aren't too strong. There's a big advantage to having the tax embedded. When we did the harmonization with the Atlantic provinces, that for a while was the notion. So we had this infamous meeting with all the retailers in the Atlantic Canada, the Bluebird Hotel in Sussex, New Brunswick. And this is why, this is a real big tangent, though people always ask, if you had to tell a student entering public policy, what's one piece of advice? My one piece of advice is you can't do public policy from sitting in your office, because you don't know how the world operates. You got to go. And I didn't know how the world operates. So let's say, for example, a woman's blouse comes from China to, I was about to say Sears, which dates the story, because we were talking about Sears at that time. Sears, like many others, and I can't say Eaton either. None of them exist. I don't even know what I could say. Let's just say a Canadian retailer. The price is actually even put on by the outlet in China before it comes to Canada. And that blouse might come to Vancouver first. It might sit in the store in Vancouver for a while, not sell, and then it might go to Montreal. And it was going to be a nightmare for them with the different tax rates we had in Canada. So if we had a unified HST in Canada, it would be, but they really did convince me that that wouldn't work. So we started working on the harmonization. I think that was a wonderful deal for the 3 Atlantic provinces came, because they had a weakness investment. And we call the retail sales tax, which is a terrible misnomer, because almost half of the revenue comes from business inputs and machinery equipment. It's not a retail tax. And that's why it was such a shame that provinces like Saskatchewan have a so-called retail sales tax, because it's a business tax. And British Columbia went to the value-added tax, and then they went back. And there's another piece of irony. British Columbia wanted to hire me to advise them on how to go back to a retail sales tax. And I said, you got to be kidding. Like, I spent a good part of my life trying to get rid of retail sales taxes, and you want. They basically exempted much of the business inputs from their so-called retail sales tax. That's just duping the people. They basically have sort of a value-added tax, but it's called a retail sales tax. But that's one of the pieces that helped. That lowered the cost of capital in Canada. That did increase our investment. It's a small step, but it was an important step. I think we should go further. It's not a winning point, but when we do the shadow budget with the CD Howe, we've always recommended you increase the GST by 2 points, but use that to pay down lower personal and corporate taxes. You know, there's in the literature, there's the public cost of funds, and there's a well-established hierarchy of what the economic costs are taxes. The most damaging taxes are corporate income. Well, the most damaged is a capital tax. We used to have one, don't have it anymore. Corporate income taxes, then personal income taxes, then payroll taxes, and the least damaging are broad-based sales tax. Even the GST is not a proper broad-based tax because there's exemptions to it, but it is the closest thing we've got going, and we should make more use of it. And yes, it can be regressive, but that's why we've got the low-income GST credits.
A lot of interesting points there. And I think that's interesting with regards to how it actually plays out. I never thought about the whole process of it. So thanks for sharing that. I want to go back to your Chrétien story. Obviously, the Liberals have been, I would argue, having a bit of an identity crisis when we had Trudeau. We're seeing a shift now with Mark Carney. But how have you seen Liberal policy shift? Because you were surprised that Jean Chrétien was in support of your corporate tax policy. But would we have seen something like that either under Trudeau or maybe now if Carney does become prime minister?
Well, I want to start by, I can't put enough emphasis on completely nonpartisan. It's been amusing to me because I have been twice branded as a member of a political party on both of them. So I like to think I was very close to Brian Mulroney, even more so Don Mazankowski. Don Mazankowski, for me, walked on water. He was the most wonderful person. Michael Wilson, and I loved that guy, and I would have done anything for him. But I wasn't of his political party. It wasn't of any political party. And when the Liberals came into power, I kept getting invited by the Conservative Party to all their events, and I kept having to tell them, I'm not a member of any political party, and I'm certainly not a member of yours. But, Don Mazankowski says, you're like, I'm almost a friend to him. And I said, well, I'm flattered that that's true, but that's not a political statement. But then when the Conservatives came in, they wanted nothing to do with me because they thought I was all Paul Martin's buddy. Well, you're a civil servant. You do your best to serve them. And, even when we were alone in boardrooms and meeting rooms and stuff with Brian Mulroney and Don Mazankowski, I never saw them talking in what I would think is politically. It was never, we hate the Liberals or we don't like the people who vote for Liberals. It was always, what's best for the country and stuff. So it was very easy to get that kind of support. And also, historically in Canada, and I explain this to my American friends down here, there is a sharp divide on every single issue in the United States. And somebody has an extreme view. And in Canada, you're 10 degrees to the right of the middle or you're 10 degrees to the left of the middle. And then, was Brian Mulroney all that different than the Liberals before him and the Liberals after him? Was Jean Chrétien all that different than Brian Mulroney's approach? Ronald Reagan talked a tough game fiscally, but ran up the biggest deficits in the United States. Bill Clinton was fairly left-leaning. He presided over the first surpluses in the United States for a very long period of time. Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin cleaned up the fiscal mess that had been brewing in Canada for decades. And actually, for the first time, other than right after the Second World War, lowered the level of government spending. So you have to be really careful about putting political tags on it. And I emphasize, again, this is not as a partisan statement, but in retrospect, the Conservatives obviously have made an error because they put so much emphasis on killing the carbon tax, and now everybody wants to kill it. So that's not a distinguisher. And so much emphasis on attacking Trudeau, and now he's not there to attack anymore. So they haven't really put anything out positively, and they need to scramble to do that. And I think that's part of it, why it seems to be a more open race. This is nothing against Justin Trudeau, but we've seen this everywhere in the world. There's a fatigue with any political leader after a certain period of time. It's like regular clockwork, no matter how popular they're at one point. When you start getting that 8th and the 9th year, the love affair starts to erode. And so that's natural, and people are open to a change. Yeah, so you're right. If you believe the polls, and who knows, it does show that things may be fairly close. And who would have thought that with a 20% percentage point lead just weeks ago in favor of the Conservatives? But it does show that because most people and the ideas tend to be somewhere around the center, there's a fluidity. You're not going to shift on a lot of Democrats or Republicans and Republicans to Democrats, but you can in Canada.
Yes, I obviously younger, still learning about politics and whatnot. But that was something Eugene said in our conversation, is like, you never know in politics. Things are rapidly changing. So many different influences. Like, again, we knew Trump was coming, didn't anticipate this flip-flopping of tariffs. We knew the tariffs were coming, but just a lot of interesting points. That's a wrap for this episode of Let's Talk Economics. Huge thanks to my guest, Don Drummond, but we're not done yet. In the final episode of this 3-part series, we're tackling some big questions. How Canada weathered the 2008 financial crisis, what former Prime Minister Stephen Harper had to say about Mark Carney's economic record, and how the housing market is holding up against the threat of U.S. tariffs and shifting immigration trends. There's a lot to dig in, so trust me, you won't want to miss it. I'm your host, Julia Pinella, and I'll see you next week on Let's Talk Economics.